whenever you're ready, we're good.
So throughout history, we've always had a question of why some nations are more successful than others. Why some grow economically exponentially, such as the United States and China, and why others seem to falter, such as Cambodia and Vietnam. And political scientists have always thought that maybe it's just to do with like government structures inside countries or economic structures and how nations' economies are run. But the purpose of this paper and this project is to try to look at it from a new lens, to try to see if maybe a nation's specific culture is responsible for why some are successful and some are not. So the study that we'll be doing in order to find the answer to this question we'll be taking a look at 3 countries that are similar in culture so that we can get a good grasp of whether or not this is true, yet also different enough for them to be considered 3 distinct cases. These countries will be China, Japan, and South Korea. Inside China, we'll be looking at the policy of the one-child policy and how that cultural policy impacted the economy. In South Korea, we'll be looking at fan-death, and in Japan, we'll be looking at their isolationism. So we can really tell that from each of these countries, we're gaining a specific cultural trait that's really unique to this country, and we're going to try to see how that impacts the nation's economic growth. So to do that, we'll be looking at GDP as the measure for economic growth. And as some of us know, the equation for finding what GDP is would be consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So judging from that model is how we'll find out whether or not these policies impact economic growth, because we'll see how these policies impact the model in that formula. So again, we're choosing these nations because they're culturally similar but distinct enough for us to make a valid argument in finding whether or not not only do these policies have an impact on economic growth, but does culture in general have an impact on economic growth and make nations more successful than others? So the exact research question for this will be, how do culturally influenced nation-specific policies affect the economic gross domestic product growth of China, Japan, and South Korea? So I'm not going to read verbatim what this working thesis is, but in a gist, it's basically telling us that we're going to try to see not whether or not, we're not trying to prove that these cultural policies or culture in general has a positive influence on economic growth, but just that it does have an impact on the nation's economy, whether it be growing the GDP or hindering it from achieving its full potential. To develop this research and to really look into it, we're going to be using a correlation analysis method, which is basically where we take different factors and see how they correlate and how they relate to each other and how strong the connection is between the two. So we're also going to need to be making some assumptions through this, and the major assumption that we're going to have to take into account is the fact that there is no official documentation that policies put in place are based on culture. So we're just going to need to see, the assumption will be that if a unique policy is put in place that is only believed really within this nation, we can call that a cultural policy. So down here we have the diagram of the research process, and how we'll be taking it through the method in order to kind of come to the conclusion that we need. So first we'll find a cultural trait and then connect it to the policy. This is where a lot of the assumption will come in place, because just mainly that there's no official record of it being put in place because it's a cultural policy. Second, we'll be able to find the policy's impact on the economy through how it affects the equation we discussed earlier. So a lot of times it's going to impact the government spending or the consumption within the country, which will raise or lower the overall GDP growth of that nation. Then after we find the impact, whether it's positive or negative, then we can see, and if there is an impact, then we can see truly what the impact of this is and if culture does in fact play a role in developing nations' economies. So just a couple terms that we'll be using throughout the presentation that usually people would know, but I just want to define just for the purposes of this specific paper. So policy is pretty simple. It'll just be what a nation-specific government puts in place to kind of, as not necessarily a law, but also just as a belief and a practice. Benefit in an economic sense and drawback in an economic sense will be used a lot, because we're going to be talking about how it improves the GDP of the nation, not GDP per capita, not wealth disparity, but just specific overall GDP, and that's what these terms will mean. And culture will mean like specific beliefs found in just these nations, in just China, Japan, and South Korea. So it's things that are unique to certain countries. All right. So now on to the findings. The first country that we looked at was South Korea. And as we know, we're looking at fan death in this country. Fan death, basically, just a little bit of background, was the belief in the 1970s and 80s that because there was such an energy shortage, and because the government couldn't supply enough energy to people, they put in place all these policies to try to restrict energy consumption on an overall basis. So one of the things that they did is they spread the false fact that leaving an electric fan on overnight while sleeping would cause you to asphyxiate and die. And so what this led to is South Koreans turning off their electric fans, turning off all their appliances when they went to sleep, which ended up saving the country a lot of energy through this energy crisis. We can see through these graphs here that the energy consumption growth down towards when fan death was a firmly held belief is quite slow, and it picks up again exponentially in the 2000s when the belief was kind of proved as false. And then what we can see through this is that it would affect consumption in two different ways. First, it would decrease energy consumption, but because South Korea was already going through an energy shortage, there was not going to be that much energy consumption in general, in total during this time, so that really didn't impact the economy. However, the money that the people had from instead of spending it on extremely expensive energy because it was in such short supply, and the price would be much higher, that they were able to spend it on other commodities and other appliances and things like that, that helped really develop South Korea's consumer-based economy. And then we can see, according to sites such as the Brookings Institute, that the consumption-based economy of South Korea really took hold within the 1980s, and it kind of switched away from the manufacturing industrial-based system that it was in the 70s and early 80s into a more consumer-based one in the late 80s and 90s. And therefore, the consumption would rise, thereby increasing the overall GDP of the nation through our equation that we discussed earlier. The second nation that we looked at was Japan, and Japan has always had a historical tie to isolationism and being closed off from the rest of the world. It wasn't until the late 1800s when Matthew Perry came and forced Japan to open its borders that it really became part of our world. And still we see that they still are trying to hold to these isolationist, xenophobic beliefs in the form of protectionism in the modern world. Japanese protectionism really saw a resurgence within what we call the lost decade, which is where Japan's economy took a major hit after its extreme exponential growth after World War II. This is because the Japanese people feared that their economy was being exploited, and that's why they were falling, but the protectionist policies that they put in place really only hurt it more and kind of furthered the spiral down that they're still facing today. So we can see through like the only way that the economy is starting to bounce back is through the current policy of Abenomics, in which it's kind of a three-step plan. The first was quantitative easing, which, as you can see from the graph, had minor success, but it wasn't very effective. And then the second, which happened more in this area, was the deregulation of the economy and increased inflation so that people will be able to spend more. So the deregulation really allowed Japan to stop putting in place kind of its protectionist policies and leave the current like isolationist state that it was in, improving foreign investment, improving other countries' companies from come in to set up shop to develop in Japan and improve the Japanese economy. And also sources from all sides of the political spectrum, from the centrist Brookings Institute and Pearson Foundation to Cato, all say that protectionism hinders economic growth. So we can see this through the empirical evidence here, that the protectionist policies that were in place before stopped Japan's economy from reaching its full potential, and now that Abe is trying to change it and trying to open up the proverbial economic doors, the economy is starting to bounce back and starting to see some signs of small recovery, even though it's not that large. It is still significant because it's still a step in the right direction. Finally, if we look at China, we can see the one-child policy and how that impacted the economy. So in just a really quick sense to wrap this up, when the Chinese put in place the one-child policy, they were short on resources, short on food, they had a lot of shortages of things. So the only way for them to truly grow economically was to have a smaller population base so that they could supply the population and make them a productive workforce. And according to the Wall Street Journal, there are three types of economic growth: labor-induced economic growth, capital-induced economic growth, and productivity-induced economic growth. So China was trying to increase its capital-based economic growth, in which it uses its resources to the best of its ability, and it wasn't able to do that with such a high population and such low resources, so it also impacted their productive economic growth in a negative sense. So we can see that when the one-child policy first started, it did help improve the economy, and it did help make China the superpower that it is today. However, now we're seeing the government in China taking away this policy because it's now going to have negative economic impacts, because if we can look at this graph here, the aging population is reaching a top-heavy model, and soon China will not be able to sustain its overly aged population with too few young workers into the workforce, thereby hurting labor-induced economic growth and productivity-induced economic growth. So basically, they would be in the same problem they were before the one-child policy was put in place. So again, we can see that the one-child policy within China does in fact impact the nation's economy, first for the better and now for the worst, which is why there was the reverse in change. So in conclusion, if we look back to our chart that we had before, through this project we successfully identified a cultural trait and connected it to a policy, whether it be official law enacted policy or just a belief and kind of actions that were taken within the country. Then we did connect the policy to the economic impact, whether it be positive or negative. Positive in the case of Korea, negative in the case of Japan, and a mixture within the case of China. And now let's really discuss the impact and how it worked and how it impacts the overall theme, which is, does culture impact economies? So what we can see from this is that yes, culture does in fact impact the economy. But nations are showing more and more signs to adapt to growing economic needs, trying to change their long-held beliefs and policies, such as isolationism, to be more open, have a more growth-based model based on the equation that we discussed before. So the really significant part of this research is that we did find that culture does impact economic growth in some way or another in each country, and that some policies that are in place do more harm than good, or help improve the economy more than they hinder it. So nations are not at an even playing field based on culture in terms of economic growth. Thank you.
Thanks, John.